The city of New Avalon hummed with life, but not the kind that welcomed all. The neon glow of streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks, casting long, restless shadows that stretched across the crumbling walls of old buildings. The air smelled of rain and rust, a bitter reminder that the world was changing, but not for the better. In the narrow alleyways where the forgotten lived, a girl with silver-blue skin stood alone. Her luminous veins pulsed faintly beneath her delicate flesh, tracing intricate patterns that shimmered with every heartbeat. Her kind called them lifelines, a sign of vitality, but to humans, they were nothing more than a mark of alien impurity. She kept her head low, her glowing eyes hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak. Drawing attention was dangerous. The Eleutheri had learned this lesson the hard way. Once, they had arrived with peace in their hearts and open hands, eager to share knowledge, to bridge the gap between species. But humanity had rejected them. Fear turned to anger, anger to violence. Now, the few Eleutheri left on Earth were nothing more than ghosts, unwelcome reminders of a failed attempt at unity. She knew better than to linger in one place for too long. But the hunger gnawed at her insides, and the promise of discarded scraps in the marketplace was too tempting to ignore. Moving swiftly, she weaved through the backstreets, her bare feet silent against the damp pavement. The city stretched upward around her, towering buildings of glass and steel, reflecting the distorted glow of advertisements flashing in forgotten corners. It had once been beautiful. Now it was a graveyard of broken promises. The marketplace was still crowded despite the late hour. Vendors shouted over one another, peddling their wares with tired voices. The smell of sizzling meat and spiced vegetables filled the air, making her stomach clench painfully. She edged closer to a food stall, her movements careful, precise. If she was quick, she could grab something before the vendor noticed. But the moment her fingers brushed against a half-eaten loaf of bread, a rough hand clamped around her wrist. "Thieving little freak," a voice spat. Her heart pounded. She yanked her arm back, but the grip tightened, fingers digging into her skin like iron clamps. "I saw that," the vendor sneered. He was a heavy-set man with a thick beard and cold, unfeeling eyes. "Think you things can just take what you want?" She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, another voice chimed in. "She's one of them," a woman hissed. "An Eleutheri." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Faces turned toward her, expressions shifting from curiosity to revulsion. "Filthy parasite," someone muttered. "Why is it even here? Should have wiped them all out when we had the chance." Fear coiled around her throat like a vice. The vendor shoved her back, hard. She stumbled, barely catching herself before falling onto the wet cobblestone street. Then the first rock came. It struck her shoulder, sending a sharp jolt of pain through her bones. She didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only made it worse. Another rock, this time her cheek. The sting of impact made her vision blur, and she tasted blood, violet, the color of her kind. Laughter, jeers, more voices rising, blending into a cruel chorus. "Go back to whatever hellhole you crawled out of." She squeezed her eyes shut. It would end soon. It always did. They would get bored. They would move on. But then the attack stopped. A sharp intake of breath from the crowd. A moment of stunned silence. And then a voice, firm, unwavering. "That's enough." Slowly, she opened her eyes. A man stood between her and the mob. He wasn't particularly large, nor was he heavily armed. He was just a man in worn, earth-toned clothes, his dark hair tousled from the wind. His boots were caked with dried mud, and his hands, though rough with calluses, were steady. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They burned with defiance. The vendor sneered. "What's the matter, boy? Feel sorry for the freak?" The stranger didn't respond. He simply positioned himself in front of her, his stance unwavering. "Move," someone in the crowd growled. "No," the stranger said. The air shifted. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then, before anyone could stop it, another rock flew through the air. It should have hit her, but it didn't. The stranger moved. The stone struck him instead, catching him just above the temple. He stumbled, a thin trickle of red sliding down the side of his face. The crowd went silent. The girl gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Why? No one had ever. The leader of the group, the vendor, hesitated. Then, as if realizing the shift in atmosphere, he scoffed. Not worth it. With a dismissive wave, he turned, signaling for the others to follow. One by one, the crowd dispersed, their excitement fading into disappointment. No blood had been spilled, no satisfaction gained. Within moments, they were gone. The girl remained frozen in place. The stranger turned, rubbing at his bleeding temple with a wince. Are you all right? She blinked at him. He had taken the hit for her. A human had taken the hit for her. She didn't understand. You're hurt, she whispered. He chuckled, though it was more of a breath than a laugh. You should see the other guy. She stared at him, trying to decipher his meaning. The man sighed and shook his head. Come on. We can't stay here. He held out his hand. She didn't take it. She didn't trust humans. She never had reason to. But this one, her eyes flickered between his face and his outstretched hand. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her fingers in his palm. His grip was warm, solid, real. Without another word, he led her away from the marketplace, away from the place that had reminded her, once again, that she did not belong. But as she followed him into the darkened streets, for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The rain had started to fall in soft, steady drops by the time they reached the outskirts of the city. She moved silently behind him, her steps cautious, her body tense. The only sound between them was the rhythm of their breathing, the occasional splash of their feet against puddles forming on the uneven pavement. He hadn't spoken since they left the marketplace. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't questioned why she was there. He had simply led her away, as if protecting an Eleutheri was something he had done 100 times before. But she knew that wasn't true. No human had ever helped her before. When they finally stopped, she found herself standing before a rusted door, its paint peeling, its hinges barely holding it in place. The building was old, forgotten, just like everything in this part of the city. He pushed it open with a creak and stepped inside, nodding for her to follow. She hesitated. Could be a trap. He could be like the others, luring her in with kindness only to betray her the moment she let her guard down. But then she remembered the way he had stepped in front of her, the way he had taken the hit without hesitation. That wasn't something a deceiver did. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped inside. The space was small, cramped, cluttered with books, spare parts, and mismatched furniture. A single lantern flickered in the corner, casting warm, golden light over the room. It smelled of old paper, of metal and oil, of something faintly herbal. He shut the door behind her and sighed. You can sit if you want. She remained standing, watching him carefully as he moved toward a small metal sink. He wet a cloth, bringing it to his temple where the stone had struck him. A thin line of red marred his skin, but he didn't seem particularly concerned. After a moment, he turned to her, his dark eyes studying her in return. Are you hurt? She hesitated, then shook her head. He nodded, tossing the blood-stained cloth aside. You've got a name? She hadn't spoken it in years. She wasn't sure she even remembered how it felt on her tongue. But somehow, the way he asked, gently without demand, made her want to answer. Saris, she said, her voice quiet, his lips curved slightly. Saris. He repeated it like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Then, after a moment, he said, I'm Dane. She blinked. A name. A real human name. Something tangible to call him. Dane. For some reason, it suited him. She glanced around, taking in the space once more. It was strange being in a human's home, if this even was a home. It looked more like a place someone had pieced together from whatever scraps they could find. How long have you been here? She asked. A while. He sat on the edge of a worn-out couch, stretching his legs out in front of him. Not much of a place, but it's safe. Safe. She had forgotten what that felt like. A sudden wave of exhaustion crashed over her. She hadn't slept properly in days, hadn't had a real roof over her head in weeks. Her legs wobbled slightly, but she caught herself before she could fall. Dane noticed. Without a word, he grabbed a spare blanket from a nearby chair and tossed it to her. "Take the bed," he said. "I'll take the floor." She stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" Dane tilted his head, as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because no one else will." Saris clutched the blanket in her hands, unsure of what to say. She had spent so long believing that all humans were cruel, that they saw her people as nothing more than pests to be exterminated. And yet, here was this man, offering her shelter, offering her kindness, asking for nothing in return. She didn't know what to do with that. For now, she simply nodded, moving toward the small cot in the corner of the room. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, curling into herself as she listened to the sound of the rain tapping against the roof. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear. Days passed, then weeks. Saris learned that Dane was not like the other humans. He did not ask questions he knew she did not want to answer. He did not treat her with pity or fear. He simply existed beside her, as if she had always been a part of his world. She learned that he was a scavenger, that he survived by trading whatever useful scraps he could find in the abandoned districts of New Avalon. It was a dangerous life, but one he seemed accustomed to. He moved through the city like he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. She also learned that he had no love for the way humans treated her kind. One evening, as they sat by the dim glow of the lantern, she asked him, "Why do they hate us so much?" Dane exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because they don't understand you. Is that all it takes? Fear doesn't need much fuel to burn." Saris was quiet for a long moment. "And you? Do you fear us?" Dane met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. No. She wasn't sure why, but that answer made something in her chest tighten. One night, they returned from scavenging to find a group of humans lingering near their shelter. Saris stiffened, instinct screaming at her to run, but Dane placed a hand on her arm. "Stay behind me," he murmured. The men turned, their faces partially hidden by the dim light. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. "Didn't take you for a sympathizer, Dane. Didn't take you for the kind of man who sticks his nose where it doesn't belong." Dane shot back. The scarred man's gaze flickered to Saris, his smirk widening. "You keeping a pet now?" Saris clenched her fists. Dane's voice was sharp. "Leave." The man laughed. "Or what?" Dane didn't answer, but his fingers twitched at his side, and Saris recognized the way his stance shifted. He was ready to fight if he had to. The scarred man seemed to notice, too. He clicked his tongue, rolling his shoulders. "TCH. Relax, we were just curious. Never thought we'd see the day a human took one of them in." One of them. Saris' jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay silent. The men lingered a moment longer before finally turning to leave. As they disappeared into the shadows, Dane exhaled slowly. Saris looked up at him. "You didn't have to do that." He glanced at her. "Yeah, I did." For some reason, her chest ached. The days that followed felt different. Something had shifted between them, something neither of them spoke about. Saris caught Dane watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She caught herself doing the same. One night, as they sat beside a dying fire, Dane reached out, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. Saris froze. He hesitated. "Sorry." She swallowed. "It's all right." Dane's gaze lingered on her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, softly, he said, "You deserve better than this world has given you." Her breath hitched. She had never been told that before. For the first time in her life, she believed it. The moon hung low over New Avalon, casting a pale glow over the fractured skyline. The city never truly slept, but in the late hours, the streets became quieter, the dangers lurking in the shadows more pronounced. Saris had grown used to living in the margins, hiding from the eyes of those who wished her harm. But now, for the first time, she was not alone. Dane walked beside her, his steps purposeful but unhurried. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of generators struggling to keep the city's broken infrastructure alive. They had just finished a scavenging run, their bags filled with supplies they'd bartered for with salvaged metal and electronics. Sarah stole a glance at him. He was different from the other humans she had encountered. He didn't flinch when she spoke, didn't look at her with disgust or fear. He treated her like an equal. And in the past few weeks, that had begun to mean something more to her than she was willing to admit. But there were moments, fleeting, stolen moments, when she caught herself wanting something dangerous. His touch lingered when he handed her something. His eyes softened when she laughed, rare as it was, and when she was close enough to feel his warmth. A strange, unfamiliar ache settled deep within her. She knew what it was, but she didn't know what to do with it. Dane suddenly stopped walking. Sarah tensed, her instincts sharpening. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the darkened alley ahead. Then he swore under his breath. Sarah followed his gaze, and her stomach dropped. A group of men stood at the alley's entrance, their postures stiff with purpose. Not just any men. She recognized the scarred one from before, the one who had called her a pet. There were more of them now, and they were waiting. Dane exhaled through his nose. "Stay close to me." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. As they stepped forward, the scarred man grinned. Well, if it isn't the Eleutheri lover." Dane's jaw tightened. "You've got nothing better to do?" "Not when we've got unfinished business," the man replied. "See, some people aren't too happy about you harboring one of them. Makes you look real bad." His grin widened. "Makes you look like a traitor." Dane didn't move, but Sarah could feel the tension radiating from him. "Let's just walk away," Dane said evenly. The scarred man chuckled. "Afraid it's too late for that." Sarah barely had time to react before one of the men lunged. Dane moved fast, shoving her behind him as he intercepted the attack. A fist flew toward him, but he ducked, driving his knee into the attacker's ribs. The man stumbled back with a grunt, but another took his place. Sarah's breath came fast. She could fight, but if she revealed too much, if they saw what she was truly capable of, it would only make things worse. A hand grabbed her arm. She twisted sharply, slamming her elbow into the attacker's face. He yelped, stumbling back, but another fist came from the side, catching her across the jaw. Pain exploded through her skull, and she hit the ground hard. "Sarah!" Dane's voice. She shook off the dizziness, pushing herself up, just in time to see Dane take a hit to the ribs. He barely flinched, retaliating with a sharp jab to his attacker's throat. But there were too many of them. They were losing. Sarah's vision blurred at the edges. Her hands clenched. She could end this. She knew she could. No. She had spent years hiding what she was, what she could do. If she revealed herself now, she wouldn't just be putting herself in danger. She'd be putting Dane in danger, too. But then she saw it, one of the men drawing a weapon. A jagged knife, its edge glinting in the dim light. He was behind Dane. Dane didn't see him. Sarah didn't think. She moved. Before the man could strike, she grabbed his wrist, twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and she spun, slamming her palm against his chest. A pulse of energy rippled from her fingertips, violet light flashing as the force sent him flying back into the alley wall. He crumpled, unconscious. Silence. The remaining men stared at her, their faces contorted with shock and something far more dangerous. Fear. "The hell was that?" one of them rasped. Sarah's chest heaved. She had made a mistake. Dane grabbed her wrist. "We have to go." She didn't argue. They ran. The city blurred past them as they sprinted through the backstreets, their pursuers' shouts fading into the distance. Sarah's heart pounded, her mind racing. She had revealed herself. There was no taking it back now. Finally, they stopped in an abandoned building, their breaths ragged in the quiet. Dane turned to her. His expression was unreadable. "You used Eleutheri abilities," he said quietly. Sarah swallowed. "I?" I don't care, he cut in. His voice was steady. I just need to know. Are you all right? She blinked. You're not afraid? Dane exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You saved my life. A dry chuckle escaped him. If anything, I should be afraid of how much I owe you now. Saris let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid either. But the danger hadn't passed. If those men talked, if word spread. Dane, she said, her voice serious. They won't stop now. He met her gaze. I know. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then, finally, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a simple touch, but it sent warmth flooding through her. We'll figure it out, he said. Together. Saris looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. The city was no longer safe. They had spent the last 2 days moving between abandoned structures, listening for whispers of pursuit. It hadn't taken long. The men from the alley had spread the story, twisting it, turning it into something even more dangerous. The Eleutheri girl was a monster, a threat. The human who protected her? A traitor. Dane didn't seem surprised. He had known from the moment they ran that there was no going back. But Saris saw the weight of it in his eyes. The life he had built here, the scraps of familiarity and survival. He had thrown them all away the moment he chose her. And he hadn't once hesitated. Saris sat beside him on the rooftop of a crumbling high-rise, the city stretching below them like a dying beast. Fires burned in the distance, the slums in a constant state of unrest. Even now, the streets hummed with tension, with eyes searching for them. Dane leaned back on his palms, exhaling slowly. They'll keep looking. Saris nodded. I know. Silence fell between them, a comfortable silence, despite the storm waiting beyond it. She turned her head slightly, watching him. He looked exhausted. A dark bruise lingered along his jaw from the fight, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Or maybe they already had. She didn't know when it happened, when her feelings had grown into something unshakable. It had been slow, quiet, creeping into her like the tide. But now, as she sat beside him, the city against them, the entire world against them, she knew, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Dane, she said softly. He glanced at her, a question in his gaze. She hesitated, heart hammering. She had spent years hiding, but this was something she didn't want to hide from. So she leaned in, closing the space between them. For a moment, she thought he might pull away, that he might tell her this was impossible, that there was no future in it. But he didn't. Instead, he met her halfway. His lips brushed against hers, hesitant at first, then deeper, like a dam breaking. His hand lifted, fingers trailing along her jaw, tracing her skin like it was something precious. Saris melted into him, into the warmth and certainty of it. There was nothing careful about the way he kissed her. It was desperate, like he had been holding back for too long. When they finally pulled apart, Dane's forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. This is insane, he murmured. Saris let out a soft, breathless laugh. I know. She could feel his smile, even in the darkness. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. The city hadn't forgotten them. Reality settled in again, sharp and cold. Dane sighed. We can't stay here. No, she agreed. We can't. His fingers laced through hers. Then let's go. She looked at him. Go where? Somewhere they won't find us. Saris wanted to believe such a place existed, but she had spent too long being hunted to have that kind of hope. And yet, with Dane beside her, his warmth grounding her, his steady grip telling her he would never let go, she wanted to try. She squeezed his hand. Okay. They left before dawn. No goodbyes, no last looks, just two souls running into the unknown, together.